Well, hello. You have made it to the last week of Humanities 101M. Congratulations. And I decided to reward you by just giving you one of these lousy videos to watch this week. Of course, I would do two if I thought that two were really necessary, but I think only one is necessary, and I think that both of us would enjoy, both I and you would enjoy having just one of these videos. I don't think really the main material that we're studying this week is Romanesque and Gothic art and architecture. And I just don't feel the need to put up an introductory video on that because one of your assignments is to watch a film called A White Garment of Churches. I have a link to it up on Canvas. It's going to link to a YouTube video, but it's one of those deals where it's just sort of 10 minutes per video. So the link is to part one of White Garment of Churches. There are, I believe, 8 parts in all. So I know it's a little bit inconvenient to have to watch it that way, but just go ahead and watch all 8 parts. And if you have any trouble finding them, let me know. But that video will give you a really good overview of both Romanesque and Gothic art and architecture. One of the things you'll want to be able to do is to talk about some of the differences between the two. But because you have that video, because the video is very helpful, I don't think I need to do that, to do an additional video for you. I would say certainly both do the Art Across Time readings and watch that video, that movie, before you tackle your last essay. The last essay you have is going to ask you about what the art and architecture of the High Middle Ages tells you about Christianity in the High Middle Ages. So you want to be able to draw both from your Art Across Time reading and from the White Garment of Churches film. What I want to do in this video is say just a little bit about the nature of medieval Christianity. You do have a West in the World reading that's going to touch on some of these things. So that's the focus of this video. And I just want to make a warning, which is that you're going to discover that medieval Christianity is very different, one might even say profoundly different, than the Christianity that most of us are familiar with. And I think our first instinct as human beings, anytime we're confronted with something that is unfamiliar, we judge it. We judge it because it's unfamiliar and it threatens our idea about what Christianity is and what Christians believe and what Christians do and so on. You may have had a similar kind of experience if you went to another church. It's very different than the church that you're familiar with. It's very hard not to be confronted with difference and not judge it in some way. I think it's perfectly fine to have opinions about medieval Christianity, but one thing that this course is trying to do is to help you think like historians. And the first task of historians is never to judge. It's never the first task. First task is always to try to understand what people are thinking and what they're doing, but not only that, why it made sense in their minds to think and act in the way that they did. And once you go through that process of trying to understand, then and only then, I think, are you really entitled to have an opinion that anybody should take seriously. So I just want to say that partly because there's many things I find to be really wonderful about medieval Christianity, but I know how different it is from what we're accustomed to, and I just wanted to give you that warning. In order to kind of get a handle on Christianity in the High Middle Ages, I want to focus on three distinct but related phenomena. The first is what I'll call the Reform Papacy. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. The Reform Papacy. Secondly, the Crusades. And third, the rise of the friars. And when I talk about the rise of the friars, that will enable me to set you up for your St. Francis reading this week. So first, the Reform Papacy. One of the most important moments in all of church history, certainly medieval church history, is this series of popes in the 11th century, second half of the 11th century, who really wanted to reform the papacy, and through reforming the papacy, wanted to reform the church at large. Well, what was the problem? Why did these popes think the church needed to be reformed to begin with? The problem in their eyes was that the church was too influenced by outside interest, we might say. And you can see this particularly in some of the highest offices of the church. So, what are the highest offices of the medieval church? Well, bishops, certainly. You also have abbots, who are the heads of monasteries. And then finally, you've got, of course, the Pope himself, who is sort of the supreme bishop. Well, by the middle of the 11th century, many of these offices were more or less bought and sold. Okay, so who decides who's going to become the Bishop of Mainz, for instance? Well, that office might go to the person who's willing to pay the most to occupy it. Or the local, a local lord or a king might appoint a person in that office, which of course means that spiritual qualifications were often not taken into account, or they certainly weren't given top priority. So starting in the middle of the 11th century, we see a series of popes who are determined to wrest control of the church and control of these high offices, to wrest it away from secular rulers, who might be Christians personally, but were not officials of the church. Take control away from them and bring that control back to the church itself, so that it's churchmen who are appointing other churchmen, and so on. The ultimate goal was to spiritually rejuvenate the church by staffing the church with the most spiritually qualified leaders, right from the papacy all the way on down. So one of the issues that's going to be tackled during this time is how the popes themselves are put into office. For quite some time in the early Middle Ages, the papacy was basically monopolized by a few aristocratic families in Rome. And other church officials had very little to say about who would be the next pope. It's kind of hard to imagine this situation, but that was the situation of the church at this time. And so Pope Nicholas II, who was one of the early Reformed popes, basically establishes a procedure for electing popes that is still binding today. The procedure was that the pope was to be elected by the cardinals. Cardinals, at least originally, were the bishops of sort of this suburban bishops of Rome. Okay, so there were a number of bishops sort of right around Rome, and those were considered the cardinals. Basically, over time, cardinals become sort of like the personal cabinet or personal council of the papacy. But the relevant fact is that cardinals are churchmen. They are ordained ministers of the church. And so in the mind of somebody like Nicholas II, they are precisely the sort of people who ought to be electing the Pope. So again, the idea is to minimize outside interference in church affairs and to allow the church to elect and appoint her own officials. So we see that reform being instituted at this time. Another reform that was attempted, at least at this time, has to do with a practice known as lay investiture. It's quite a mouthful, I know. Lay investiture. Lay, L-A-Y, investiture, I-N-V-E-S-T-I-T-U-R-E. Well, what is that? Well, investiture refers to a ceremony in which a bishop was installed in his office, or an abbot in some cases. And during the investiture of a bishop, the bishop would be given the symbols of his pastoral office. So a ring, which symbolizes that the bishop is in a sense married to the church, and a staff, which is a kind of obvious pastoral symbol. But what a lot of these Reformed popes in the 11th century found rather galling was the fact that at these investiture ceremonies, in many cases, it was a king or another noble who was investing the new bishops, giving them the symbols of their spiritual authority. And of course, that's only half the problem. The deeper problem is that it was often these kings or local lords who were choosing who was going to be bishop in the first place, or abbot in some cases. And so that's sort of the investiture bit. The lay just means non-clergy, okay? And of course, all these lords and kings who would invest bishops, they were all Christians, but they were not clergy. They were not ordained ministers of the church. They were lay people. So you have lay people investing bishops and abbots with the symbols of their spiritual authority. And increasingly, higher-ups in the church started to think that this was problematic. It had been going on for quite some time, at least a century, maybe more, in places like Germany. But when Pope Gregory VII comes into office, he decides that this is a practice that simply cannot and should not be tolerated any longer. And so that sets up this long and rather nasty conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. You're going to read all about that, so I'll leave you to it. I'll just say that the problem was not really resolved until both of those guys were dead, both Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV. It's not actually sort of resolved until 1122. And again, I'll let you read about that as well. But it takes several decades for this issue to be decided in some sort of satisfactory way. Okay, I also said I would say something very briefly about the Crusades. And yeah, I want to be really brief about the Crusades. You're going to read about them. I don't want to say much about them except this, that you should keep in mind who it is spearheading and encouraging the Crusades right from the very beginning. It's the papacy. So a lot of scholars today see the Crusades as one function of this reform papacy that I was talking about. It's Pope Urban II in 1095 who calls for the very first crusade. This is a time when popes are looking to enhance their power and their prestige. And the Crusades were one strategy that some of these popes took to enhance their power and prestige, and in a way to assert their independence from secular rulers. So I just want to make sure that you see the Crusades from that perspective as well. Finally, I said I'd say something about the rise of the friars. So far, we've only been talking about one side of the medieval church, the upper echelons of the medieval church, popes and bishops and abbots. Well, what about regular people who really want to devote their lives to Christ, who really want to live the Christian life to the fullest? What are some forms of Christian devotion, new forms of Christian devotion that we see in the High Middle Ages? So I want to talk about the friars who were supported by the popes, who and in turn the friars supported the popes. So there was a kind of mutual reinforcement there. So even with the friars, there is a connection with the papacy. And I'll come back to that in just a little bit. So what makes a friar different from a monk? Now, you may remember I touched on this in my lecture on monasticism, but let me briefly review it. A friar is different from a monk because a friar is not bound to the cloister. Monks are really supposed to stay in their monasteries if at all possible. That was certainly the ideal. Friars, on the other hand, make it part of their very identity that they mix and mingle in the world, that they evangelize, that they preach in public. So they're not bound to the cloister as monks were. Now that's one side of it. The other side is, in many ways, friars are a product of the monastic tradition. Friars would take the traditional monastic vows of poverty, of celibacy, of obedience. And in some cases, friars are going to take that vow of poverty even more seriously than most monks would. And you're actually going to see a classic case of this when you read the biography of Francis. Because one of the things that I think you can't miss about Francis is his devotion to poverty and taking that devotion to rather extreme lengths. So there are two major orders of friars that arise in the High Middle Ages. I've already alluded to one, the Franciscans, named after their founder, Francis of Assisi. The other group you want to know something about, and you'll read something about, are the Dominicans. But both groups really are formally organized for the first time in the early 13th century. One thing the groups have in common, they're different in some ways, but one thing that both groups have in common is that they were both dedicated to the stamping out of heresy. Heresy was increasingly becoming a problem in the High Middle Ages. A heresy is a form of Christianity that is deviant in some ways, that is out of step with the mainstream church, that knows it's out of step with the mainstream church and persists in its out of stepness anyway. And you're going to read about a couple of groups of these heretics. Some of these groups were actually not in some ways terribly different from mainstream Christianity. The Waldensians would be an example of one such group. Other groups like the Cathars, otherwise known as the Albigensians, don't worry about the spelling right now, you're going to read about them. They were really on the fringes of things, and you'll find out why I would say that. Either way, both Franciscans and Dominicans they really wanted to persuade heretics to recant and to rejoin the church. But both Franciscans and Dominicans became very involved in organized church efforts to discourage and indeed stamp out heresy. The Inquisition, which I'm sure you've all heard of, the Inquisition gets its start during this time, and the Inquisition was staffed almost exclusively by friars, by Franciscans, and by Dominicans. All right, the last thing I want to do in this video is say a few brief words prepping you for the St. Francis reading. You're not actually reading one of St. Francis's own writings. We have some of those, You're not reading that. You're going to read an early biography of St. Francis by a guy named Thomas of Celano. And he wrote this biography about 20 years or so after Francis's death. The first thing that's important to recognize is what kind of literature we're dealing with here. This is not what we might consider to be a realistic biography. Rather, this is what is called a hagiography. 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 In Greek, what that means is the biography of a holy person, the biography of a saint. So the object of this life of St. Francis is not to give a kind of objective historical account of Francis's life. Rather, the object is to put Francis in the best possible light so that readers might be inspired to aspire to Francis's holiness, to a life of greater Christian discipleship. So that's the genre of literature that you're reading. It's got a number of characteristics that you find in almost every example. You're going to read about some miracles that Francis performs. That is exactly what you would expect in a hagiography. Francis never really takes a wrong step or makes a mistake. Again, that's just part of the genre. Well, who is this Francis guy anyway? He was the son of a merchant, fairly wealthy merchant. He has this kind of conversion. I mean, he's Christian from the cradle on, but he has this kind of conversion that you'll read about. What's interesting about Francis is that he never really moves up in the hierarchy of the church. Now, he's got a huge influence, one of the most influential Christians who's ever lived, but he was only a deacon. He never became a priest, much less a bishop or something like that. What he does is he goes around, and you'll see this, he goes around and he preaches the gospel, and he preaches and embodies a new form of the Christian life, the life of a friar, which I've already mentioned. It is he who actually establishes an official religious order. It becomes known as the Franciscans. Starts with just a few people. Eventually there'll be tens of thousands of them. But he is the one who formally begins that order. A few questions to think about as you read. One question is, what makes Francis's vision of the Christian life distinctive? What does he seem to think the Christian life should look like? Second, I've already mentioned his obsession almost with poverty. Why do you think poverty was so important for Francis? Why did he emphasize and live out poverty in the way that he did? And finally, I want you to think about what happens to Francis at the end of his life. Shortly before he dies, he has a fairly dramatic experience. I won't give that away, but I think you'll know it when you get to it. And think about it, and what do you think the author is trying to say about Francis and what he represents? There'll be moments when you're reading this biography, well, you're going to have moments of skepticism, like, did that really happen? Did Francis really do that? Did that really happen to Francis? In a way, those questions don't really matter. At least for our purposes right now, they don't really matter. What you need to focus on is, why would the author present Francis as doing this or saying this, or why would the author say that this happened to Francis? So be thinking about that. One last point. I mention this because this might not be immediately obvious upon reading the text. Celano's Life of Francis really presents Francis as a kind of a church reformer. he presents Francis as an antidote to the kind of spiritual decay and decadence that he saw in the church of his day. And you can see this very early in the biography when Francis receives a call to repair this decrepit church, the Church of St. Damien. And then he goes on to repair other dilapidated churches. Now, again, we could say, did this really happen? Is this historical? That's fine, but put that to the side. What's the symbolism here? What is the author trying to say by having Francis repair and restore these church buildings? I think he's saying that this is actually what Francis is doing for the church at large. He is bringing restoration and reform to the church at large. So there's a real implicit critique here of the worldliness of the church of Francis's day. There's another scene where this, I think, really comes through. Among other things, Francis, you will find out, is pretty much the inventor of the live nativity scene. So you're going to read about a live nativity scene that he organizes. And at that scene, someone has a kind of vision. And they have a vision of Francis approaching the manger and waking up the Christ child. And let me read this quote. This is what the text says. So you'll read about this. I just want to put this on your radar. The author says, and he's explaining the meaning of this vision. In the hearts of many, the child Jesus really had been forgotten. But now, by his grace and through his servant Francis, he had been brought back to life. So Francis is the one bringing Christ back to life in the hearts of the people of Italy, who were all nominally Christian, but many of whom were not living the Christian life at all. Now, one question that all of this raises is, how does Francis get away with this? How does Francis get away with adopting and promoting a way of life that in many ways was a kind of standing judgment on the church and its obsession with wealth and worldly power? If you compare a group like the Waldensians that you'll read about, the Waldensians and the Franciscans have very similar views on poverty. So why does Francis succeed where the Waldensians fail? And here we come full circle back to the papacy. I think it all comes down to Francis's respect for the church's hierarchy. And that's also a point that Thomas of Celano tries to drive home in his biography. Francis made sure he got papal permission to preach, papal permission to start a new religious society. The Waldensians, on the other hand, were asked not to preach, and they persisted in preaching anyway. They defied the ecclesiastical authorities, and they ended up paying for it dearly by being branded as heretics and being persecuted accordingly. So we started with the papacy, and we're going to end with the papacy. All right, that's all I have.